Welcome, everybody. My name is Tucker, and this is a very different podcast episode for me. If you're listening to this on Spotify or iTunes, then this is actually live on YouTube right now. So if I talk to someone in chat or bring up something that someone said in chat, then that would be why. But in this week's episode, I actually have AFunkyDiabetic coming back once again. I wanted to bring him back. He was obviously the first guest that I had on the podcast, just because there's a lot of interesting stuff going on, specifically dealing with the Celtics and the Lakers and just all the NBA stuff that we could possibly talk about. I would want to have Funky on the pod. So how you doing today, bud?
Doing pretty good. Can I just say that I love this podcast? I've listened to every one besides the one that I was on because I can't stand to listen to myself. And it's been really good.
Yeah, I appreciate it. Yeah, I think when I really, started doing YouTube more consistently, I realized, one, how much I dislike my own voice, and two, how often I was going to have to listen to it anyway. And that's, if someone would ask me, what's one of the bigger downsides, it's just having to listen to yourself all the time when you want to, edit your own videos. But we're going to start off talking about just some general LA Lakers stuff, because obviously now LeBron has returned to the lineup for the last couple of games. And there's a realistic possibility, whatever we are, 50 games in the season, almost to the All-Star break, that the LA Lakers might not make the playoffs. They're out of the playoffs right now. I believe the Kings are in the 8th spot. And then the other team they're going to have to jump is probably going to be the Clippers, but they don't really seem all that intent on making the playoffs, judging by trading away Tobias Harris and the fact that they would keep their own pick this year if they didn't make it. So just general thoughts. Where's your panic meter at on the Lakers potentially missing the playoffs? If you were a fan of them, how concerned would you be? Scale of 1 to 10, 1 being not concerned at all, 10 being we're going to miss the playoffs and have a lottery pick.
I don't know about a 5. They have LeBron James. And I mean, I don't need to explain that one to you, but I think the biggest thing for them is health right now, because Josh Hart's going through something and his shot making was rough for a little. And without Lonzo, I know people want to crap on Lonzo, and I'm there with you sometimes with the shooting, but his impact on defense is just legit. And I don't think he's the only reason why their defense has been kind of bad lately. Some of that was because JaVale just kind of sucked last night against Philly. But what Lonzo gives them, just that defense, and then also the really fast reactions to plays in transition in the half court, he just gives them that extra jolt of energy. And after those two being healthy, I think I would kind of like to see LeBron at point guard a little bit more. I know you can't do that all the time because of Lonzo and Rondo. And the idea with LeBron at the point guard position is you then give him as much shooting as possible. The downside to that is you might be forced to play a lot of your ball handlers together, which kills your shooting. So I know you're going to have to do a balancing act, but I think this team has enough good players on top of course, arguably the best player ever. I think he's the best player ever, to where I just really hope they can get the 7th seed, because then I think they could actually go on a bit of a run. But you mentioned the Clippers. I think it's weird. The front office may not want to win, but the team is actually still pretty good. I mean, Lou Williams dropped like 45 last night. I know they still lost, but if that's going to be a trend, then they're going to be in any game. The Celtics, of course, had a meltdown against them. Sacktown's going to go for it. The Spurs, I don't know what to make of San Antonio. I don't know. I guess my gut reaction is actually that the Lakers will get in there. And I mean, I don't want to upset Kings fans, but perhaps they're the team that's going to fall out just because they're the young team and they're still relying on guys like Willie Cauley-Stein and things like that, I guess.
Right. I think, and obviously we're assuming in this that health is not a factor. Like if someone gets hurt, whether it be significant or only be like a 2-week injury, that's going to change a lot of things. And it does kind of seem like, yeah, it's the Clippers, the Kings, Spurs, and Lakers. But for me, honestly, I feel like the top 7 is pretty much set. I mean, I can't really imagine the Spurs not making the playoffs just because they are who they are. And then it pretty much comes down to, do you trust this, up-and-coming Kings team with all this young talent? They play hard every game. They get up and down the floor. Or do you trust, a very similar situation with the Lakers plus, obviously, LeBron? And my gut instinct there is to obviously side with LeBron and say there's no way that they're going to end up missing the playoffs. There's no way the guy's going to go from making the finals 8 times in a row, albeit in an inferior conference, to not making the playoffs at all. So my panic meter would be right around yours, maybe a 5 or a 6. And again, I think it's just going to depend on health. I agree with you about Lonzo. I didn't really expect his defensive impact to be his calling card, I guess, at this point, but I think that is something that they're missing because it's not a lineup with a ton of flexibility. And I think with at least his size, it does provide them that a little bit. Obviously, the shooting is going to continue to be kind of sketchy. But my frustration with this team more than ever just continues to be Brandon Ingram, because I don't understand really his role, I guess. I mean, it seemed like they were grooming him the last couple of years that he's been with the team, obviously prior to LeBron, to be kind of like a playmaking wing on and off the ball and kind of an equal opportunity offense. And that doesn't really fit with the way that the Lakers are going to need to play down the stretch to make the playoffs. Maybe that was the idea initially with having guys like Lance and Rondo and then Ingram around LeBron, but that continues to be my frustration. And maybe that's where the adjustment comes from. Like you said, is LeBron handling the ball even more? And that could potentially mean a decrease in role for Brandon Ingram just because of his shooting struggles. Not that they have a ton of shooters, but for you, what are you kind of pinpointing other than the things you already mentioned, obviously with the exception of ball coming back, injuries and things like that, some kind of adjustment with the exception of the LeBron thing at point that you maybe could see them making? For me, definitely defensively, there are still some issues. You saw Joel Embiid absolutely destroy them the other night. How would you kind of remedy some of the things that you are seeing in terms of deficiencies? What adjustments would you make that maybe could help them make the playoffs?
Well, I'm hoping that JaVale can hold up. So maybe it's just give Tyson more minutes. Whether he can still do it for, I mean, how old is he now? However, 35 or whatever he is. I don't know. I would love to see Ingram used in just more creative ways. But if we're talking about a playoff run where you just got to go 100% at this point, I think it'd be cool to see some lineups where it's basically, to go back to the LeBron point guard thing, LeBron and as much shooting as possible. Because between Josh Hart, hopefully if he's making shots, KCP, who's up and down and sometimes really annoying, but if you ask him to stand in the corner and shoot threes, he's serviceable enough. Kuzma, who for the season has not shot the three well, but he has an ability to just go off like he did against Philly in that first quarter. The Reggie Bullock pickup, I'm a big fan of. And do I say just go for that as much as possible? I think what was that? 4 players with LeBron and like a serviceable center, whoever that may be between their two guys. I think that team's really difficult to defend. And at that point, if I got LeBron and a really good offense, I think I'm almost guaranteed to get into the postseason.
Right. And I do think that just based off the deadline, you talked about the Bullock thing. I've got to assume that the spacing that Mike Muscala provides is coming into play here at some point, because Zubac was playing extremely well before they traded him. And he was obviously the third guy in their 3-center rotation. So I guess that the thinking there was to get someone that can stretch the floor a little bit more. And like you said, rotate McGee and Chandler at the 5. And I guess maybe depending on matchups, you play, whoever in the starting lineup. Not that it really matters because JaVale is only going to play 20, 25 minutes a game anyway. But I think you're probably right. And that's, again, where I'm coming from with the Ingram thing. Maybe it is, like you said, using him in more unique ways, but probably more on-off splits between him and LeBron. Because it's not that he's not a talented playmaker. It's just that he doesn't provide enough in that setting to warrant getting as many touches away from LeBron as he has been to this point. So maybe, like you said, it is a LeBron, Josh Hart, KCP, Bullock, Muscala lineup, and then you can work in some of those other playmakers in the few minutes that LeBron is not on the floor, and just rotate those guys in and out, and essentially going completely away from really what the offseason plan seemed to be. Because I think we kind of forget that, it's not like they were given this group of players. It's not like they were stuck with Lance and Rondo. Like, they chose to sign those guys because they had some master plan on some different way to play. And now they're pivoting back towards the traditional, this is how you play with LeBron. You put as many shooters on the floor as you can. And that's shown in the moves that they made at the deadline.
Yeah. And you mentioned sprinkling in the other guys. I think Ingram in a setting of LeBron, guys who can shoot, and then Ingram being the one guy who's not as much of a shooter, I think he can be successful in that setting. As far as how it actually happens, I don't know whether that's him cutting, him in transition, him getting a few ball handling opportunities here and there. And I think he's probably the most interesting one, because I just think his ceiling is still the highest among all those guys. I mean, Kuzma's been better this year. I'll give you that. But I think Brandon Ingram at his absolute best right now, maybe not a big scorer, but the defense, the rebounding, as Zach Lowe would put it, a secondary ball handler, that's still a really valuable guy to have. So I don't want to make it sound like I want Ingram to have a priority over the other guys, because I think Rondo and Lonzo and these guys are still important, and occasionally very important. And the case I made for Lonzo would suggest that I think he needs to be out there a lot. But there's something about Ingram where when he's clicking, I think that's when this Lakers team can be at their best.
That's true. I would say that especially this year, whether Ingram's on the team next year or not, the best version of this Lakers team does involve a Brandon Ingram that is on his game. I don't know how often that happens with LeBron on the floor at the same time. And then someone in chat, Coach Max says, and I'll answer this first so you can have a second to think about it. He said, what would you think of a lineup with LeBron at the 5, maybe against small ball lineups or teams with undersized centers? And I don't think that is an entirely foreign concept to someone like Luke Walton or really any coach in the NBA at this point. But I don't imagine it's going to be a regular season combination that we'll see, at least for very long at all, because the concept is always to rest LeBron as long as possible. And then in the playoffs, maybe you'll see it more. But they have 2 good centers that I think they can continually roll out there at the 5. And at this stage of LeBron's career, I wouldn't imagine seeing that unless it's in some kind of more desperate scenario. But it would be an interesting wrinkle to potentially go to, but I wouldn't imagine it would be for very long or anytime soon.
Yeah, I don't want LeBron. I mean, I get it from an offensive standpoint because you can just blitz teams, but then LeBron's got to box out and LeBron's got to be in the middle trading elbows with these 7-footers. And I don't want my 33, 34-year-old LeBron to do that.
Exactly. Coming off of an 18-game absence from a groin injury, especially if anything happens to him, honestly, if he misses 5 games, they're probably not going to make the playoffs. I think they're that pretty desperate of a situation injury-wise, at least, especially with Lonzo still out. I don't know when he's going to come back. Hopefully it's relatively soon for the sake of their team and for Lakers fans. And like you said, I mean, you don't want to have this guy continually get banged up. I was listening to the Bill Simmons podcast earlier in the day when he had Chris Bosh on, and he said the biggest difference that he saw from him this year compared to when he was in Cleveland, obviously Miami, is he's banging into guys less this year even than he ever has before, and he's taking less contact, whether that be offensively or defensively. And I would imagine that's a theme that's going to continue. So I think we're on the same page there. And with the Lakers in general, I would imagine that they're still going to make the playoffs. I'm not saying that the Kings won't make a push. And again, injuries could come into this, whether it be to the Spurs or to the Kings or even to the Clippers. Like you said, they're still going to be competitive. I just don't really think that their priority is especially towards making the playoffs this year. Whether it happens or not, I don't know. But I would say that it's probably, in my opinion, I'm with you. I'd like to see them get to the 7 just because I feel like they could probably beat anybody. Denver's not playing as well lately as they were in the beginning of the season. I feel like they could realistically beat anybody if they're playing well in a 7-game series. It's not the Warriors, and I think in general it would be good for the league and more entertaining for the Lakers to be in the playoffs as long as possible. But I, in my opinion, I would say they're probably going to end up at 8, the Spurs maybe at 7, and the Kings and Clippers are going to be in the outside looking in. Would you say that's fair, or are you thinking a different combination?
I mean, I think it's fair. 3 games with 25-ish games left against the Spurs. That's tough. That's a tough thing to do. I just really hope they get the 7 because I don't want LeBron to bounce in the first round.
Right. I would agree. We're going to move on though to Boston Celtics, who I don't even know what word to use for their season anymore because, I mean, other than just outright confusing, there's been week-long stretches of things being really promising and turning around. There's been drama. There's been just everything, really. And I'm going to briefly, like I said, I know that I talked about this with B-Souls last week, so I don't want to cover it for too long. But I want to briefly talk about the comments that Anthony Davis's dad made last week. Obviously, I'm sure you're very happy that Anthony Davis is still a Pelican at this point. Basically saying that they are not a fan of this, or not they. Anthony Davis's dad is not a fan of the Celtics franchise in terms of his son playing there because of, as he said, the treatment of Isaiah Thomas, however you want to phrase that. What, if any, impact do you think that should have on a player's desire to play for a franchise? And do you think that assessment on his dad's part is fair or no?
I think it's fair. I mean, if I was a player in the NBA, I would want to be somewhere where I was confident that I was going to be there 3 years from then. And my GM wouldn't have the mentality of, you're good, but if some other guy becomes available, you're probably out of here. So I get it. Now, as far as the actual quote from his dad, I mean, he very well could think like that. And I guarantee that quote is real and all that. But was there not a little bit of clutch sports going on with that quote? The timing of it all, the fact that the Celtics were the one team that would make the Pelicans be like, well, maybe we should wait on this trade. But with that being said, the Isaiah Thomas situation, I mean, it sucked. Okay. It's possible to make the right basketball move and also do something that is kind of messed up. And in the sense of everything that happened with Isaiah Thomas and his sister and playing through the injury and the uncertainty of how transparent the Celtics were about his hip injury, I get it. And I don't know, it's an unfortunate situation. And it could potentially bite the Celtics in the ass.
Right. I don't think anybody's going to argue that from a transaction standpoint that the Celtics made the right move. They ended up with a better player. They got value out of Isaiah Thomas and certainly got more value out of him than any of the teams that he's ended up playing for since he was traded from the Celtics. And you're right. It's possible to make the right basketball move and do something that maybe morally wasn't great, but it's not really Danny Ainge's job to be especially moral, I guess is the best way to put it. But I agree with you, just like everything else with this Anthony Davis situation, whether it's in the past or in the future, timing is important and context is extremely important because we haven't heard anything from Anthony Davis's dad about the Celtics or Anthony Davis himself about the Celtics and whether or not he wanted to play there publicly until 5 days before the trade deadline. And they really, really don't want to play with New Orleans the rest of the year, right? Like suddenly they have a very strong opinion about the Celtics and about not wanting to play there. And like you said, maybe it was a ploy to tell the Pelicans publicly, we don't want to go there. And if you trade us there, if you trade Anthony Davis there, he's not going to re-sign. So maybe the Celtics look at that and say, we're not all that interested. And suddenly the Lakers package becomes that much more appealing and maybe they pull the trigger. So I think you're right. And I think it's well seen to kind of see through that and see the context of that situation. And just, that's something that we always have to keep in mind, right? It's very easy to have a strong initial reaction to these things without thinking about it in the first place. Like it came out last week that basically this was a one-way conversation. This was not something where the Pelicans called the Lakers called the Pelicans, and they had a conversation about what Anthony Davis was worth, trade talks, things like that. It was just the Lakers saying, this is what we'll give you, and the Pelicans saying, okay, that's interesting. Like there was really no dialogue, and it ended up, I guess, being because they were just messing with him and they were trying to get him back for whatever tampering issues and whatnot. So it's just an important PSA, really, to keep in mind context and keep in mind other variables other than just maybe what's right on the surface. And really briefly, I want to bring this up to you because I thought it was just a really interesting question, and B Souls didn't really have that much of an answer initially, and then when he thought about it, he did. If it ends up being the case that the Isaiah Thomas trade treatment, however you want to put it, is a determining factor and is the thing that prevents the Celtics from being able to trade for Anthony Davis, because in my opinion, if they think it's going to be a rental, I don't think there's any way they're going to trade Jason Tatum to the Pelicans, which means to me, I don't think the deal is going to get done. If that's the case, if Isaiah Thomas's situation prevents you from having Anthony Davis, would you go back in time and say, that's fine, we'll re-sign Isaiah Thomas for whatever contract and move forward with that group and then end up having a chance to get AD in the future? Or would you say, no, that's fine, we'll keep Kyrie, we'll re-sign him and then have the opportunity, or not have the opportunity, to have Davis? I know it's kind of a complicated question, so if you don't fully understand it at first, that's fine. But which side would you be on initially?
Yeah, I get what you're asking. I'm gonna make this really difficult on you because I'm gonna say, number one, is it a max contract for Isaiah Thomas?
Well, I don't think this. So I'm going to say no because I don't think the Celtics would have given him one, even if they had kept him. If the Kyrie thing didn't come up, I don't think they would have given him one. Let's just say you're paying Isaiah let's just say it's 4 years, 100. Let's say you're paying him 25 for the next 4 years.
Okay, so I'm paying Isaiah Thomas $25 million a year. We're assuming that his health is the same as it has been.
Correct. You're assuming that because the Celtics would be knowledgeable of that situation. Yes, let's say that his hip injury resolves itself in the exact same way.
then I would rather have the situation they're in right now.
And
because I understand everything that can be said. There is a very real possibility. Kyrie leaves, they don't get Anthony Davis, suddenly they're a 45-win team. I get it. I would still rather have that because they still have Jason Tatum, they have Jaylen Brown, they would have the hope of Gordon Hayward bouncing back, and they still have the draft picks. And I would rather take that with my cap not being destroyed than Isaiah Thomas.
right. And I would probably be in the same boat, and that's a similar answer that Beasles gave, just that he likes the group that they have. The Kyrie thing is obviously the big question mark, whether it be now or this offseason for the Celtics. I would probably be in the same boat. But I do think it's an interesting question because I think it's realistic that ends up being the case, that is something that, well, I mean, again, it could just be an exaggeration of the situation. It could just be a ploy on the part of Clutch Sports to force a trade when they did, and maybe they're actually more receptive to being in Boston than they're making it seem. But again, I don't think that Danny Ainge is going to look at this and say, okay, I'm going to have to give the Pelicans, Jaylen Brown, Tatum picks, whatever, in exchange for a year of Anthony Davis, and cross my fingers that he doesn't go to LA, either LA team or New York in 2020. I don't think that that's possible. I don't think that he's going to put Jason Tatum on the table, which opens up other teams. Do you think that, one, in general, do you think Tatum is on the table? In your opinion, I guess the better way to phrase it, would Tatum be on the table for you? Obviously, you have no idea if he is or not. And whether or not him being a rental affects you putting Tatum in the deal or not.
Well, first I have to get a gauge on Kyrie. Well, actually, before any of that, there needs to be a successful playoff run. Because if this team gets bounced in round 2, which I think is very possible right now, then I think at that point you got to play it conservative. But if I have a gauge that Kyrie wants to stay, I don't even know, because you can compare this to, let's say, the Paul George trade. The Pacers traded Victor Oladipo, who wasn't that good at that time, and Sabonis, who did not have a good rookie season, mainly because they didn't use him right. But what they sent out for that doesn't compare to what Jason Tatum projects as right now. I really don't know. I would have to be very confident that Kyrie is staying, because I think the timing is where it's weird, to where it's like either Kyrie has to sign or you got to trade for AD, and then the other one is convinced or something like that. Because I don't think Kyrie is going to sign on the dotted line the moment he has the opportunity. I don't know. It goes back to Kyrie, I guess.
Right. And it's one of those things where even though the Celtics currently are still in a very good situation, there's no denying that, 12 months from now, like you said, you could be the 7th seed in the East, or 45 wins is probably the 5th seed. But you could very realistically not have Kyrie and not have Anthony Davis on the roster. And it's not like Jason Tatum or Jaylen Brown or guys like that can't continue to be good for y'all, but it's just crazy how we've always just kind of assumed that a Celtic super team was at some point coming, and that it probably involved Anthony Davis. And now we're staring in the face the possibility of neither Kyrie nor AD being on the team. One last thing on the Celtics, because we're spending more time on it than honestly I thought that we would. Do you miss the Isaiah Thomas Celtics teams at all when things were a little bit more, I don't want to use the word fun, but maybe a little bit more surprising, that you guys were as good as you were, that Isaiah Thomas himself was as good as he was? Maybe not so much like the year that he was traded for and you guys were like 40 and 42 or whatever, but specifically like the 16-17 season when he was second team All-NBA. Do you miss those teams at all after going through what's been a pretty tumultuous season as a fan so far?
I miss Isaiah Thomas. I don't miss that team, because let me tell you, that team wasn't that good. Okay, that team had one guy who could create his own shot. Every wing besides Jaylen Brown was under 6'5". They didn't have a single good rebounder. They should have won 47 games, or maybe less than that, but Isaiah Thomas being really the king of the fourth was some wild stuff. And of course, his series against the Wizards was otherworldly. What was actually the more fun Celtics team was the year before that. I think that was when they either traded for Isaiah, or it was, I don't remember the timeline. It was the year before Isaiah Thomas went nuclear. Because that team had this sense of like camaraderie. and just togetherness. And they were like the fourth best defensive team in the league or whatever. And they figured it out enough on offense. And there was just this sense of this team isn't good and they're figuring it out. That was really cool to watch. And now this team should be really good, and they're the 5th seed.
Right. And I guess you probably don't miss like Avery Bradley, like 20-footers or things like that when Isaiah Thomas is on the bench. I get that. And honestly, I get that feeling from a lot of Celtics fans that they do miss Isaiah Thomas himself on that team, because it was a really special year. I don't especially remember that year before for the Celtics. That could have been like the Brandon Bass teams, or, you know what I mean? Like it could be, my timeline could be off, but I do kind of feel like I'm going through something similar to that right now with my Nets, because I think the league-wide consensus is the Nets are not extremely talented. I mean, D'Lo's good, and Jared Allen's good, and Karis LeVert's coming back, Dinwiddie's good, but it is definitely fun to see a team that's really not complete. Like Travion Graham is playing for us, like guys that we drafted in the second round in this past draft are playing, and we're contending for the 6th seed. And it's like you said, it's just fun to see a team that isn't just overwhelmed with talent, but is just still finding a way to figure it out and be better than a lot of people thought they would be. And being that surprise team, as opposed to being the team that has all these expectations on them, certainly, at least from the experience that I'm having so far this season, is a pretty fun one.
Yeah, sometimes basketball is just cool like that. I think, what did Jason Tatum say? First off, I love your Nets. I love the Nets. I love everything about them. But what Jason Tatum said, it kind of got to their head a little bit before the season. Yeah, I have no choice but to believe him based on the output.
Right. Yeah, and the only other question that I've seen kind of thrown around on Twitter today is Markieff Morris being available and the Celtics potentially being a destination. Would you be okay with two Morris brothers, twins, on the Celtic? I mean, I feel like he could help you. I don't know how many more wings you really need, but
I don't know. Markieff kind of sucks.
He
is
does
the thing.
a little bit, yeah.
I guess for the sense of morale, maybe, because if anything, it'll make Marcus happy, and Morris is actually like extremely important to this team. So, sure, why not? Just have him ride the bench, play 7 minutes here and there, get Semi Ojeley's spot rotation minutes every now and then. Why not?
Right. All right. Well, we talked enough about the Celtics, as I feel like we always do. We end up, I swear, we talk about the Lakers and Celtics every week. But we're going to move on to the NBA trade deadline, and everybody has, their opinions, and everybody's putting out videos about the trade deadline. And one of the more interesting things before we move on to this year's trade deadline was something that I thought about when you talked about Oladipo and everything a couple of minutes ago. I'm doing a video tomorrow. I just recorded today just talking about the 2017 NBA trade deadline, going back 2 years, because everybody always says this is just my initial reaction, and we never really know how well trades worked out until, a couple of years later. And it's just weird because the Magic ended up trading for Serge Ibaka from the Thunder for Oladipo and Sabonis and Ilyasova, and then those guys got traded minus Ilyasova for Paul George. So, and then the Magic ended up getting Terrence Ross and a pick that ended up being nobody for Serge Ibaka. So the Magic traded Terrence Ross and a pick for Paul George, essentially. Which is, it's just crazy how we can look back in the deadline a couple years later and see the true impact of these trades, I guess. But just kind of give me a breakdown of maybe your favorite deals. You can pick more than one. I have one in my head specifically, your favorite deal from the trade deadline that you thought really helped one team or both teams if you think it's a win-win.
I really like the Magic, not the Magic. What am I saying?
Nobody likes the Magic. Stop.
Yeah. Well, they got Fultz, and I guess we could maybe talk about that.
Okay.
But
Sure.
I like the Wizards with the Bobby Portis move because they got under the luxury tax for this season. They just got a discount because Bobby Portis is going to run them like maybe $10 million, whereas Otto Porter was 27. And Bobby Portis is probably better than Otto Porter.
Right. I know you heard it already because I got a little heated about the Otto Porter trade last week because I just felt like everybody was excited about the fact that the Bulls got Otto Porter, and I didn't understand it because I'm not going to repeat myself everything that I said last week, but it doesn't really help the Bulls to have Otto Porter on their team. And you're right, to get out of a contract like that and get someone in Bobby Portis that's going to be able to help their team, and like you said, is going to be much cheaper. They got out of like if he ends up signing for 10, like you said, they got out of like $17 million in salary, and then they dumped Morris as well to get on the luxury tax. I like that one a lot, as you said, for the Wizards. Mine personally, from a bit more of like an on-court perspective, maybe not so much salary-wise, is Mirotic to the Bucks. I think a lot of people have this opinion of this particular deal. I think most people expected some kind of first-round compensation to go to the Pelicans if Mirotic was going to get moved. Obviously, Anthony Davis is not really a possibility for them anymore, so they're getting rid of whoever they can. And I really like the Bucks. The Bucks are my favorite team in the East in terms of a team that could end up representing the conference in the finals. I'm still kind of waiting and seeing on Philly, who plays tonight, just because they've looked awesome since Tobias Harris has come over. But Mirotic solves one of the bigger issues that I had, not solves, helps remedy one of the more pressing issues that I saw for this Bucks team. And that was just the fact they were relying so much on Brook Lopez to provide front court spacing. And it's not that I don't love Brook Lopez, because I do, former Net. I loved him with the Nets. His transition from one of, a 20-point per game low post scorer to being one of the more high volume 3-point shooters in the league, certainly in the front court, has been awesome to see. But I questioned his defensive versatility, his defensive mobility in the playoffs, and the possibility that he gets forced off the floor in some playoff series in certain matchups, similar to how we've seen guys like Ryan Anderson get forced off the floor in the past. And not that Mirotic is going to be some kind of outstanding defensive presence, but I think we can all agree that on that side of the floor, he is an upgrade in terms of mobility from Brook Lopez, while still providing a similar level of floor spacing. So in terms of a contending team, certainly within the Eastern Conference, that helped solve one of the issues that they had, the Mirotic trade would be my favorite.
Yeah, I think that Bucks team is super versatile because they got so many guys who can play a few positions. Giannis can play every position. And I think we could see some of him at center and then Mirotic at the 4. Let's say Bledsoe's having a rough game. You could put Brogdon at point guard. Tony Snell can play either wing position. Ilyasova can, he could do his Ilyasova thing. That team's good. They're probably my pick to make the finals. And if my Celtics run into them in round 2, well, first off, my Celtics would have to beat Philly, and I have doubts they can even do that at this point. But if they have to run into the Bucks in round 2, I don't, unless Gordon Hayward goes wild, I don't think they really have a chance. The Bucks are loaded.
Right. And Hoops reference in chat is saying that Mirotic isn't a good defender either. I'm not trying to claim that he is an outstanding defender by any means, but I think if we're looking at it relative to Brook Lopez, and I understand that's a low bar, I still think that it's an upgrade. And again, you can really never have too much spacing. But I do think the Bucks Celtics point is an interesting one, because if we're being honest, y'all probably should have lost to the Bucks in the first round last year. You didn't play especially well, and I think there were some coaching decisions on the side of Jason Kidd that could have gone the other way, and you realistically could have lost, you obviously being the Celtics, in the first round last year. And the other interesting storyline is the Indiana Pacers without Victor Oladipo could really screw up what we perceive as the top 4 teams when healthy in the East, obviously being Toronto, the Bucks, Philly, and Boston. If the Pacers keep moving up the standings and, let's say Philly or Toronto or the Celtics end up at like the 4 or 5, then they're going to end up having to play each other in the first round, not the second round. And that would be a scary proposition for any of those teams. And it's probably most realistically staring your Celtics in the face than any of those other teams.
My team's screwed, man. I am convinced that this year is going to end in disaster. Kyrie's going to leave, and Twitter's going to be rough for a while. I'm just never going to look at the replies of a Bill Simmons tweet.
Yeah, I'm sure it's bad having at least 3 top 5 picks on the team, being in the conference finals last year. Yeah, I'm sure it's tough being a Celtics fan. Must be bad. Can't relate though as a Nets fan, but I see what you're saying in terms of the future is bleak potentially, and things could come crashing down quickly because, like I said, we've always just kind of assumed that the Celtics team was up and coming, and I've been in a video saying that for 2 years now, that this was kind of the next team. This was the team that was going to. I don't dynasty is too overused of a term, but was going to be next, I guess, essentially, whether it be in the East or in the league. They've got all these picks. They've got these young players. The Fultz thing worked out perfectly for them. They ended up getting Kyrie, the possibility to get, at the time, maybe it was DeMarcus Cousins. Now they're shifting focus, obviously, to Anthony Davis. But it could end up, like you said, being a disaster. What about, well, first, if you have any other favorite trades from the deadline that you want to talk about, then feel free to. But otherwise, we can move on to your least favorite deal from the NBA trade deadline.
I don't think I have any more favorites because I don't think I can say anything about Marc Gasol that hasn't already been said. I don't know. My least favorite. My brain immediately went to the Otto Porter move because I'm trying to think of another move that actually happened that I would be like I wasn't a big fan of. Can I say this? If I can cheat a little bit, can I say a team that didn't do that much?
Sure, go for it.
Because there's two. One is OKC. I think they really could have used another shooter. And number two is Portland, because I love Damian Lillard so damn much, and I just want to see that guy on a team that isn't just this good, consistent team in the West. I want to see them kind of go for it a little bit. And I know they got Rodney Hood. Meh. I mean, it's Rodney Hood. I would have loved to have seen them get Mirotic. They have all of their picks. Would you have to place some protections on it? Probably. I guess the equivalent of 4 seconds could be like a protected first or so. And I think they could have even used it as an opportunity to get out of one of their bad contracts, because I think the Pelicans would have been willing to take on someone, maybe Evan Turner, maybe not. He's been a little better this year, I guess, if you would have given him a pick. So you could have got yourself a knockdown guy, much better offensive player than Aminu, and I think that would have helped him.
Right. I think you're right about those two teams in terms of they should have done something. I think we've really gotten used to the Thunder as being someone, or a team, that just kind of finds a way to get guys that we don't really anticipate them being able to do. And they really didn't do anything. And you were talking about shooting. They released Alex Abrinas. I don't know what his future is. And Portland is really interesting to me just because I feel like you said, they're just kind of stuck in this mold. Like, they're never going to contend. They might have a really good seed like they did last year, but they're going to run into problems with their versatility in the postseason. And Damian Lillard is just continually someone that we really forget about as one of the better backcourt players in the league. And with how well Yusuf Nurkic has been playing, even though I like Zach Collins as a young prospect, maybe he's someone that becomes expendable, like you said, whether it be to offload a contract or to have some kind of upgrade on the wing that is not Rodney Hood. I don't really know where Portland sees this going. I mean, I'm not saying that they have to get rid of everybody and restart if they're not contending with the Warriors, because really nobody is. But it seems like they're very content to continue to win, a little bit less than 50 games, or maybe potentially over if they go on a really good stretch run, and maybe make the second round. And I think that's a very old school way of thinking, and I would have liked to, just like you, seen a little bit more aggression from them in adding some pieces to Dame and McCollum, or maybe, potentially trading McCollum.
Yeah, I mean, those two, they've got 3 years left, which at this point is effectively 2 years left. And we see that's when the rumors start getting out there of star players wanting out, is basically when you have 2 years left. And if Portland plays it too safe, they could lose both of these guys. I mean, maybe CJ would re-sign because, I don't know, that could be like the homegrown kid kind of thing where they drafted him and he's been there the whole time. But I could picture Dame being like, you know what, guys, I gave it my all. I want to compete for something else now. And you mentioned Zach Collins. Like, I know Zach Collins gets this praise as being the young prospect. Nurkic is 24.
Right.
Like, I don't think Zach Collins is good enough to where it's just like, we have to keep this guy. I mean, Nurkic, I know box score numbers are not everything. He's putting up 15 and 10. And sure, he's sometimes a little soft at finishing around the basket or whatever, but the dude's good. And I think playing it too safe, all that stuff.
Right. And I think it's interesting looking back on the fact that Nurkic and Jokic were on the same team in Denver. And for a while, they really kind of struggled with who to choose, I guess is the best way to phrase that. And because they both were good, but they both obviously couldn't coexist. And then they ended up trading him for Plumlee. And I think even though we use big three way too often as a phrase, I think it's a legitimate, core three guys. And I think Nurkic is included in that. Again, I don't really think he's someone that we think about that often. You're right. Zach Collins is probably very much expendable at this point. Nicholas in chat says, could you guys talk about some dark horse playoff teams, some team that's being overlooked and can make some noise, maybe a second round or conference finals appearance? I'm actually going to flip that a little bit. You can feel free to answer it in whatever way you want. I'm going to talk about a team that I think has the potential to disappoint in terms of where they are right now in the regular season standings and then where they end up in terms of postseason success. And that's the Denver Nuggets. I briefly mentioned them earlier. The last time that they were this good, they won 57 games a couple of years after they traded away Melo. George Karl was coach of the year, and they lost in the first round, and George Karl got fired. And I'm not saying that they're going to lose in the first round. I would have hoped that once they started to get some of these guys back from injury, Will Barton, things like that, that they would have been better than they have been lately. I don't have the numbers in front of me, but just watching them, I'm not as impressed with them as I was in the beginning of the season. The defense is regressing, and maybe it's just the case of getting fatigued near the All-Star break, and then they'll turn it on and they'll be, the second or third best team in the West once again. But to answer the original question, probably OKC, which is weird because I've never really been a huge fan of them because they just have never seemed to have enough wing depth, enough spacing. But it's one of those things where they're almost weird enough that I kind of like them. Like, they're almost different enough in terms of being so strong defensively and Paul George being at a near MVP level that I could see them just having Paul George just being incredible in a couple of series and making the conference finals, which would probably be, above expectations for them going into this season, judging off how things went last year. So you can answer both or one or the other. Doesn't matter to me in terms of a team that maybe you think could surprise in a bad way or a good way in the postseason in either conference.
It's kind of weird with OKC. And they kind of remind me of the grit and grind Grizzlies, even if the offense looks a little different because it's more ISO heavy, because they're just so damn tough and strong and defensive minded. And Jeremy Grant has been one of the best role players in the league this season. Steven Adams is better, all that. I get everything with OKC. I think that's fair. The team that I'm picking for the West that can be a little better, this might be a weird pick because they nearly made the finals last year, is Houston. Because I'm still banking on, is Chris Paul healthy? James Harden's losing his mind. Clint Capella. Those three with just respectable pieces around them, I think that team is still terrifying. Eric Gordon has figured out his shot. They basically swapped James Ennis for Shumpert, which may work, may not work. I do think they still need one more backup wing because I'm kind of afraid that Gerald Green's going to get real minutes in a playoff run. But I think the Kenneth Faried pickup was good, and I think the star power of those two guards is still enough to where they can really do something.
Right, and they found a way to get a couple of usable guys, whether it be trade deadline, like you said, with Shumpert, and then Austin Rivers and Kenneth Faried have been really good for them once they got them, certainly better than they were for their original teams to start this season. To me, I'm not discounting Houston whatsoever. I'm beginning to question the sustainability of the Harden thing. Again, maybe it's just we're getting close to the All-Star break. And I'm also beginning to question the viability of Chris Paul as one of those like star guys. I know he's coming back from his injury, but it just doesn't seem like he has enough or what this Rockets team needs. And obviously that's crazy to say less than 12 months after. Had he been healthy, they would have made the finals last year. And I agree with you about the concerns with Gerald Green being a wing that you're counting on in the postseason. And we've talked about the Rockets lack of wings seemingly forever, ever since Ariza and Bob Moute left. There don't really seem to be a ton of promising buyout candidates. Wesley Matthews obviously ended up in Indiana. We'll see what happens with some other guys. The health of Capella is going to be important. But I do see what you're saying there in terms of the Rockets maybe being a team that could be better than maybe we expect in the postseason. But we're going to start to wrap it up a little bit. The last topic we're going to talk about is pretty broad, just some things that you're looking forward to towards the end of the season, whether it be All-Star break, playoffs, you can even stretch it to the draft, whatever you want to talk about, off-season, whatever, things you're looking forward to in the next 3 or 4 or 5 months of the NBA.
Well, at this point, with 20-something games left, I'm mainly watching, besides random national games that are good, I'm mainly watching the Celtics, Philly, the Raptors, and the Bucks. And then my Western Conference League Pass teams, I guess, are pretty much the Kings and the Lakers, because everybody else is either I know what they are, or I don't know. Those two teams are just a little extra exciting for me. I don't know. The thing with the playoffs is I can be excited as I want to be, and then I know the Warriors are still going to win.
Right.
So it does put like a little bit of a damper on it. I think the thing I'm most excited for is to see if LeBron can just go on another wild playoff run, I guess. As for the off season, I don't know. I mean, I think I can't grasp it really until we see how the draft plays out. I guess right now the Knicks are, what is it, 15% now, or the lottery odds or whatever?
Something like that, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. Do they get Zion? Do they get RJ Barrett? Do they get Ja Morant or whatever? I don't know. I know this is kind of a weak answer, but it's just with the way the NBA has been the past few years, when everything's fine and out of nowhere, Kyrie Irving wants to get traded from Cleveland. I don't know.
Right. You touched on some things I was going to talk about. I think a lot of people, especially after the trade deadline, we haven't even talked about, things like Tobias Harris going to the Sixers. Everybody's talking about that top four in the East. If it ends up being the top four, like I said, with the Pacers making moves, second round of the playoffs in the East is going to be really interesting to me. Not that the West isn't going to be interesting, because the other 7 teams outside of the Warriors are all going to be pretty close competitively, depending on who makes it in. Yeah, and I think the other thing, like you said, is just how postseason results impact our perception of what's going to happen in the offseason. Like you said, if the Celtics lose in the first round of the playoffs, or the second round of the playoffs even, I think there's going to be a lot of nerves in Boston. And I don't know. I think, like I said last week, more than ever, we're probably going to be focusing on the offseason earlier and earlier than we ever have in the past. But those are certainly things to look forward to and evaluate. But like you said, it's still the Warriors at the end of the day, and how they perform is pretty much set in stone. I mean, since DeMarcus Cousins has come back, they've, I think they've lost 2 games, maybe 1 or 2 games. They played extremely well. And like you said, we kind of all know where this is going, even if the ride there is going to be entertaining. For me personally, outside of that second round of the East and potentially conference finals matchups, yeah, the offseason is probably more where my excitement comes from, because I feel like there could potentially be a shift that would shake up what we've experienced for the past, 3 years, 4 years now, that the Warriors have had KD. The only other thing for me is just going to be, you talked briefly about the draft. The Zion thing is going to continue to be an issue. Not an issue. It's going to continue to be a crazy story, but also the Knicks, like you said, with the possibility of them ending up with the number 1 overall pick, because I think that puts them firmly in the Anthony Davis sweepstakes, if you want to phrase it that way. And I've tweeted this before, but kind of my dream scenario is that we're sitting there on draft night and the Knicks have the number 1 pick, and the Celtics are kind of wavering on whether or not Tatum is on the table. The Lakers are still trying to throw everything at him. And those are the 3 offers that the Pelicans are staring at. And that to me would be, because I love just NBA craziness in general. I love that, like you said, things happening out of nowhere, where Kyrie is 16 months removed from being a champion, wants to be traded. And that would be kind of my ideal, my ideal crazy NBA scenario.
Yeah, I mean, we don't know if that actually happens, but if that does occur, where it's basically maybe the 3 most profitable teams trying to get the next great trade chip, if I'm the Pelicans, I'm pretty tempted by Zion with that offer. I mean, I don't know if Jason Tatum's on the deal in that point. But yeah, I don't know. Zion, he's something, man. I picture him, and I know I just kind of like went off track a little bit here, but the idea of Zion Williamson being like a super athletic Draymond in a way, where I think his defensive impact can be like otherworldly. Defend potentially all 5 positions, protect the rim, all that. Be a great low post defender, and be an absolute bulldozer to the rim. That might be the best trade chip that the NBA has going for it.
Right. I think that, and I've said this before, if that does end up being the case, whether it's the Knicks or really any other team, I guess, at the top, that is, in my opinion, the most valuable thing that you can have in an Anthony Davis trade. And that brings into question whether or not the Knicks would include it. I mean, it's Anthony Davis, so you would imagine they would. But I agree. I think that initially, honestly, and I've said this before, I was not all that impressed with Zion Williamson. I saw him in person at an Atlanta AAU event and was kind of on that he's a man among boys hype train. He's just an incredible athlete and wasn't all that skilled to the point that I was overly impressed. And then he got to college and I watched him play. I was like, oh my gosh, this guy can pass. Shooting is going to be a question mark, but he's incredibly versatile and is just obviously an outstanding athlete. And I think that his skill level has been kind of like I initially thought, kind of pushed aside because of how good of an athlete he is. Some people in chat are talking about the possibility of him ending up in Atlanta. The Hawks can't really help but win games since Zach Collins has come back, or John Collins, excuse me. But that would certainly be an interesting fit with Herter there and Collins and Trae Young. But yeah, I think especially once we get to the draft, that is going to be the dominant storyline is Zion and where he ends up, how that affects the Anthony Davis stuff and all that. But I think we're going to go ahead and wrap it up for this week. Do you have anything coming up? I know I mentioned this last time and you said you didn't really know what you're doing day to day, but obviously you have the NBA Plus Stuff pod. You have your own YouTube channel, obviously, coming out with stuff every single day. Anything you want to let people know about before we wrap up?
Yeah, I'm going to do it's a Markelle Fultz video, which is why I mentioned the Magic very briefly today, because I got that in the back of my head. Yeah, I don't know. The Celtics are killing me. That's what I got.
I'm not, for the first time in, I don't know. I don't even know how long. I'm not that envious of the Celtics situation. Not that I wouldn't love to have the guys that you have, but just from a fan perspective, I'm having a lot more fun, I feel like, this year as a Nets fan than you are as a Celtics fan. So from that standpoint, I'm not envious. I'm still envious of the roster, the picks, the possibility to have the guys you might have. And who knows? A couple months from now, maybe Kyrie and AD will be there and, you'll be jumping up and down. But playoffs are going to be interesting. The stress that it puts on you, a fan, is probably not going to be fun. But your city just won 2 championships, baseball, football. So I think you guys will survive, even if things do start to go south. But thank you, man, for coming on this week. Thank you, all of you that are here live or that you're listening to on iTunes and Spotify. I have a couple videos coming up. Like I mentioned, the next one is going to be looking back at the 2017 NBA trade deadline, just looking at some trades that were made then, how they panned out to now, in kind of an NBA rewind fashion. But so be on the lookout for that. Once again, my name is Tucker. This has been the Sporting Logically podcast with this week's guest, AFunkyDiabetic, and I will see you all next time.